Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session, Legends and Legacies, which follows on from this morning's film showing of David Hare's drama about Robert Moses, Straight Line Crazy, although this is a standalone event, generously supported by Lee and John McNary. I'm delighted to introduce Roberta Brandes Gratz in the middle, David Hare at the far end, and their interlocutor, Anthony Wood. Roberta Gratz is an award-winning journalist and urbanist who's been observing and writing about cities, how they grow, fall apart, and recover for more than 40 years. Her books include We're Still Here, Ya Bastards, how the people of New Orleans rebuilt their city. Her most recent publication is It Is a Hell of a Town, Joan K. Davidson and J.M. Copeland Fund and the Fight for a Better New York. And most relevant to today's discussion, The Battle for Gotham, New York in the shadow of Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs, who many of you will have seen as characters in the film show that you will just have watched here. In 2004, Roberta, with author and urbanist Jane Jacobs, founded the Center for the Living City to build on Jacobs' groundbreaking work. From 2003 to 2011, Roberta served on the New York Landmarks Preservation Commission, where, appointed by Mayor Michael Bloomberg, she helped preserve New York City's most significant buildings and neighborhoods. For those of you who are not present at this morning's film showing, here's a brief synopsis of David Hare's distinguished career as the UK's foremost dramatist. David Hare's first full-length play was produced in 1970. Since then, he's written over 30 stage plays and 30 screenplays for film and television. His stage plays include Plenty, Pravda, Racing Demons, Skylight, Stuff Happens, The Absence of War, and Beat the Devil, his current drama, which actually he'll be performing himself as it takes the shape of a monologue in New York for a couple of days after he leaves here. For cinema, he's written The Hours, The Reader, Damage, Denial, and Weatherby. His reputation as England's most important playwright, many of whose dramas are centered on social and political issues, as is today's, was sealed by the fact that in a millennial poll of the greatest plays of the 20th centuries, 5 of the top 100 were written by David Hare. David Hare's play, A Straight Line Crazy, which many of you saw the filmed version just before, a compelling account of Robert Moses, the most powerful urban planner in New York for 30 years, and his opponent, Jane Jacobs, was premiered in London in March 2022 and transferred to the Shed, where it was the hottest ticket in town and a sellout in New York, So Anthony Wood, who's this session's moderator, is himself a preservation activist, author, historian, non-profit coach, grant maker, and philanthropic advisor. A former board member of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, he's past chair of the Preservation League of New York State, Partners for Sacred Places, the Western Playhouse Theatre Company, the Drayton Hall Site Council here in Charleston, and is Chairman Emeritus of the Historic Districts Council in New York City. His forthcoming book, Servant of Beauty, Landmarks Love and the Unimagined Life of Albert Sprague Barg, will be published in spring 2025. So it's my pleasure to hand you over to Tony Wood, Roberta Gratz, and David Hare.
Okay, Robert Moses has been dead for 40 years. Jane Jacobs for about half that period. And we're still fascinated by these legends and still debating their legacies. I think maybe one of the reasons is they have become the personification of two different views of urbanism, of cities, of planning, of democracy, and the use of power. All issues relevant in many cities today, including Charleston. So we have probably two people who are uniquely situated to help us understand their legacies and these two legends. And I want to start, David, by asking you, so what's a nice, famous English playwright like do writing about Robert Moses?
Well, I mean, I think the better question is, why are American playwrights not writing about Robert Moses? I mean, he's just one of the most interesting people, and I'd read Robert Caro's biography, which I'm sure many people here have read, and I'm hoping, if I have a very long deathbed, to read his book about Lyndon Johnson. I think we're into volume 5, aren't we? But I had read it, never thought about it, and then Nick Heitner, who used to run the National Theatre and now runs a commercial theatre called The Bridge, asked me to write about Moses, and I just felt I had something to say that was different from what Caro's thesis was. And Caro's thesis, essentially, I'm assuming everybody knows who Robert Moses was and that I don't need to explain, but that his thesis was essentially that he was a man corrupted by power, and that he created a new power center which was independent of government because he took tolls on his roads, and with the money that he took when you throw your dimes into the bucket, he collected that money. It didn't go back to government, it went to him. It went to his institution, and he was able with that to continue his super plan, his Uber plan for transforming New York State. Now, it was Caro's thesis that this was all about power. But I didn't think it was about power. I thought it was about a dream that Caro had, because the first thing he did that was most famous was create Jones Beach. And Jones Beach, if you've ever been there, was an idealistic venture. It was that the people who lived in the tenements and the poorest conditions in New York should be able to go out and go somewhere healthy where they could swim. And if you go to Jones Beach and you have to go by road, as the play makes plain, because it's the only way to get there. You can't get there by public transport. You have to go by private transport. But when you get there, it's rather like a Soviet beach. There is no, it reminds me of East Germany before the fall of the wall. There is no advertising, there are no nasty signs, there are no sales pitches, there's no boardwalk. He loathes boardwalks. It's a place of physical culture, of a kind that used to be loved in the Soviet Union and East Germany. And it was a vision. And for him, the roads were only a way to get there. And he believed that the only way to get there was with the motor car. And so there is something completely idealistic about him. And what interested me was how the idealism became so rigid over a 40-year period. The car was the instrument of his dream. And so everything had to make way for the car. And New York City had, as it were, to be subjected and submit to the means of transport whereby he could liberate the working class. But it didn't seem to me that his vision, so I didn't believe he was corrupted by power. And there is a ridiculous film called Motherless Brooklyn, in which he's represented by Alec Baldwin, and he's represented as a sort of mafia chief. And he talks about burying people in cement. And you kind of go, this is not Robert Moses. Robert Moses was a highly overeducated man whose god was Samuel Johnson, who was very, very literate and articulate, and who had an idea about he was comparing himself to the Greeks, the Romans, to Haussmann in Paris. He was working by historical analogy. You may or may not like what he did, but he is not he's not a mafia chief by any stretch of the imagination. And so what fascinated me was how a dream, which originally was so liberating, became so rigid and ceased to be liberating. By the time he's talking about knocking down Soho, and by the time he's talking about knocking down Washington Square, his dream has become a nightmare and is completely. But personally, I identify very strongly with him. I am a toxic white male myself. And I can see how my dreams have failed to adapt to reality over a 40-year period. And that is really what I wanted to write about, which is why I invented the fictional character of Fionnuala, who is the person who is at his side and, as it were, calls him on it as it goes. Maybe I just don't know enough about power, and maybe I'm power blind. It's possible. But I don't think that Moses was primarily about power. He was about a design idea for New York, which has been copied all over America, and of course has made so many cities so difficult to live in America because you can't live without a car because of the Moses template. But nevertheless, it was a dream and it was an idea. It was just tragic that the idea became so rigid.
Roberta, Jane Jacobs.
Well, first I have to say, I love that David wrote this play. He did, certainly, I saw it in London, I saw it in New York, and in New York he did, for thousands of New Yorkers, who had never read my book and had never read Bob Caro's book, and really did not understand what a power this man was. So I was thrilled. My own experience is that I was a reporter at the New York Post before Murdoch in the late 60s and 70s. I was writing about the people in the neighborhoods who were impacted by the Moses view of the city. Things were being torn down, things were being rearranged, and the neighborhoods were in bad shape. A lot of these people were, from the bottom up, reviving their neighborhoods. They were coming together in neighborhood groups, they were forming neighborhood watches, they were doing street fairs, they were planting flower boxes, they were doing things that were reviving their neighborhoods. The planners were still talking about big projects and clearance projects being needed, and these people were resisting. I was inspired. I suggested writing a book about this, observing it nationwide. My proposal was accepted by the same editor at Random House who was Jane Jacobs' editor. So we signed the contract, and he said to me, well, now you have to go to Toronto and meet Jane Jacobs. I said, okay. I had not read Death and Life of Great American Cities. I went home, I read the book, and I said, oh my God, this is someone who is talking about what I'm seeing and what all the experts are telling me is not possible. So I went to Toronto, we hit it off immediately. She couldn't have been kinder, and also showing me around Toronto in ways that were reinforcing what I was seeing. So she became basically my tutor beyond what I had understood, and I became her voice of what was happening in New York, because she had left New York in '68, but she was very interested in what was going on. And that began a friendship that lasted 30 years.
So the disciples of both Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs have been basically having kind of an intellectual tennis game over the years. An award named for one, an award named for the other. An exhibit on one, an exhibit on the other. A book on one, a book on the other. And you memorably said at one of those events that was kind of repositioning Moses, you were saying that somebody was saying, well, we're rehabilitating Robert Moses, and your response was, nobody needs to rehabilitate Jane Jacobs. So in a sense, David, your book is a little bit about rehabilitating, if you will, reframing Moses, kind of the...
Explaining Moses, yeah.
Explaining him, but Roberta...
But you see, I'm not really... I'm to a degree interested in urban planning. Of course it's a fascinating subject, but I'm a playwright. I'm not a non-fiction writer. I'm writing about Moses because he represents all sorts of things that are interesting to me, that I hope the audience will recognize in their own lives. Not just instructional, factual stuff about history and about cities, but actually what I'm talking about, which is the idea of how do we keep ourselves nimble and move as times move, and how tragic it is when you're left, as Moses was, with ideas that were way out of date, ideas which had originally been creative, but after 40 years were actually destructive. And I was faced with the obvious dramatic problem in wanting also to include Jane Jacobs, that they never actually met. So, you know, as a playwright, I'm faced with what we call the Schiller problem, who invented a meeting between Elizabeth I and Mary Queen of Scots in order to write his play, Mary Queen of Scots. But in fact, Mary Queen of Scots and Elizabeth never met. And I didn't want to make a issue of, I didn't want to write a false scene. And indeed, as we were saying, Shirley Hayes is actually the person, an actress, is actually the person who is the prime, as Jane Jacobs herself acknowledged. Shirley Hayes is actually the prime mover of the Washington Square movement. And rather inconveniently for me, dramatically, The Death and Life of American Cities is written after the time of my play. But what fascinated me about Jane Jacobs is how politically ambiguous she is. Remember, one of her biggest fans was Barry Goldwater. And there's a reason for that, which is this whole philosophy of let's not have any planning is, of course, a right-wing philosophy as well as a left-wing philosophy. And it's very interesting, the collision of the two things. Planning bad, according to the libertarians, on the extreme right. Planning automatically bad. Authenticity automatically good. And yet, as I say at the end of the play, authenticity, meaning leave Greenwich Village alone, has resulted in the most expensive piece of real estate in the world, which has driven out any working class people. When I was young, I went, as I referred before the film, to Paris in 1964. And in 1964, there were working class people living on the left bank. You cannot believe it. It was a mixed community. In the same cafe that Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir were drinking were people in blue, the same shared community. And that's what the village was at a certain point. And that is what the village has ceased to be through the benign operation of conservation. And there is a paradoxical difficulty about all this subject. And to pretend that Moses was not sincere, which he was, although he was very destructive, he was sincere about building roads along which he hoped working class people would be able to speed to quarters of the city that were more pleasant than the quarters they lived in. So the more you work on this subject, the more dissatisfied you are with the idea that conservation is automatically wonderful and that planning is automatically bad.
Of course, in a sense, there wouldn't be anything to, if Moses had been there, you wouldn't have the buildings, in a sense, without the conservation.
Of course.
Either way, you would have ended up with a different village. But Roberta, you have some thoughts on this, I imagine.
I do indeed. First of all, I am and was a journalist. I was rejected outright by all the planners. What do you know? You're not an expert. Jane was not an expert. And if you look at the people who have been successful at changing their fields, they are always the outsiders. That's a whole nother issue. But let me add, my biggest problem with Moses is not a lot of the things he did, because he did bring the highway through the city all across the country, and cities everywhere now are trying to undo the kind of thing he did. But he did it only for the upper white class. Everything he did had a racist side to it. When he built swimming pools in New York City, he hated the idea of building one in Harlem. So he built one in Harlem, and he made the water cold because he said black people don't like cold water. when he was forced to extend Riverside Park on the west side of Manhattan beyond 96th Street, which he resented. He put a comfort station in the park with a frieze of monkeys for Harlem. He was on every level adhering to an idea that I find abhorrent. Some of his ideas, okay, Jones Beach is what everybody points to, but he didn't let people go by train. He built the bridges, as you point out, too low so buses can't go through. It was for the upper white class. Today, of course, it's for everybody, but there's that side of Moses that I just find cannot be overcome. It's just contemptuous. Sorry.
Not to get into kind of planner wonkiness, but in terms of people who think about cities today, you'll also often hear the comment, we really need somebody who could be like Robert Moses light. You know, if we could just inject a little, Jane Jacobs DNA into a planner, we'd have the perfect thing of both worlds. Someone who could make something happen, but do it in a way that was sensitive. Possible? Is that what we should be striving for?
It's very interesting. You don't hear that so much anymore in New York. What we need is somebody to get things done because so much has happened. It's awful. And you'd think Moses was around. We're now building a wall of towers across 57th Street. You've seen the images. There are 3 more spaces being filled by towers going up 100 stories. We're going to have a wall east to west. No, Moses did this. This is being done because developers now own and control New York. So but for a long time, people would say we need Moses to get things done. And things were getting done all the time. I don't know what they were talking about. Well, they're not saying it so much anymore.
Let's go to London for a minute. I mean, it's kind of fascinating how well, it was brilliantly written, but how well the play was, the audiences that came to it. I mean, here, in New York, Moses, kind of most people know about, but, how many people have read The Power Broker in London, So
it's not known, but on the other hand, by the way, I totally agree with the racist critique Roberta has. It's completely true. He was a deeply racist man. There's no question about that. And there's no question about the idea of his nice clean beaches meant nice clean beaches for white people, as Fanula says in the play. And that was his idea of what was nice. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And the discrimination against black people in terms of the resources is just astonishing that he was so prejudiced in that way. I've no doubt about it. But I think that, in London, there was a very interesting thing when I was asleep in bed at 11:15 and the phone went and I couldn't work out who it was. And then the next day, Nicole, my wife, said to me, "Who rang you?" I said, "I've just got this feeling at 11:15 last night, Norman Foster rang me." and sure enough, Norman Foster next day rang again, and he'd been insanely excited by the play. And he said, it's interesting because just before COVID, we had been put in charge of trying to rebuild the biggest slum in Mumbai. And the first question we had asked ourselves was, how do we preserve what is good about this slum before we destroy what is bad about this slum? And that is sort of a tribute to Jane Jacobs and to Jane Jacobs' ideas that the most famous architect in England had been, when asked, he no longer thought, oh, let's just knock down the whole slum and rebuild it. It had been more, given that slum life, and I've written a play about slum life based on Catherine Boo's book, Behind the Beautiful Forevers, so I know a little bit about slum life in India. What is great about a slum in terms of community and in terms of people doing things for each other, how do we preserve that and not just totally destroy what this slum represented? And I think that is a subject that fascinates people all over the world, about what do we do about progress in that way. And I also hope some metaphoric side of the play, on which I keep insisting, also resonated with English audiences. Also, Ralph Fiennes is in it, so who's not going to go?
Yeah.
He's wonderful.
Yeah. Just curious, the injecting into your play of the allusions to Moses' wife, which kind of pop in, and to which he reacts like, why? But why?
Why? Because he, just like any toxic white male, totally destroyed his wife. You know, that's what he was doing on the side. While he was building New York, he was destroying his family. And, you know, all that going to work every day, and meanwhile she was drinking herself to death. And it's not complete unless you tell that side of it.
No, got it. He had two wives, though, right?
What?
He had 2 wives.
Yeah, he then married a fan.
A secretary, right?
I mean, a lot of toxic white males in old age marry the fans, don't they? Because the fans give them an easier time.
Yeah. Have we lost any white toxic males if they walked out during the course of this event? That would be sad. I know I'm jumping all over because there's so many threads to pull on. I'd like to go back to the portrayal of Jane Jacobs. So, I mean, you knew Jane Jacobs. If she had been sitting in the audience, how do you think she would have reacted to how she...
She would have loved it. And she would have she loved Bob Caro's book, and she's not in it, which is a very controversial point in New York, because Caro left out the Village. He left out the Lower Manhattan Expressway, which would have destroyed what became Soho and part of the Village and part of Chinatown. He left her out entirely. But she loved it, and she told me she and her husband, Bob, they read it to each, they were lying in bed, they ripped the book in half. And she read half, and he read half, and they would stop and say, "Oh my God, you gotta hear this, you gotta hear this." So they loved the book, and she met Caro, and she told him she loved it, and they both kind of compared notes on the fact that neither had met Robert Moses. So she would have loved it.
But you can tell me the truth of the urban myth, and it relates to anyone who was lucky enough to hear Simon Sebag Montefiore yesterday afternoon, when he said that a book can only be 1,100 pages long, and that the spine of a book will not carry more than 1,100 pages. Once you go over 1,100 pages, you have to go to 2 volumes, and publishers hate 2 volumes.
I never knew that.
And so, yeah, and so Simon was saying that his history of the world was a history of the world in 1,100 pages. And, you know, good for him. But is it true that there was a chapter about Jane Jacobs and that it got cut because the book could only, I mean, the spine of my book is pretty well destroyed through use, my Caro. But is it true that it was written and then...
The only person who can answer that says there was, but no one has ever seen it.
And so the editor didn't see it, Gottlieb didn't see it.
Personally, I don't know if he really wrote it.
There are multiple rumors. I talked to Caro about this, and it was kind of like, well, there are a couple of chapters in storage, and we had to cut them out. But he very much talks about that there was like another book that was basically had to be cut down to get it to the size. I didn't know the binding issue, but I mean, that's his narrative.
So my question is, and I have to say I know Caro, but I have not posed this question to him. There was when he wrote the Moses book, Jane was not on everybody's mind. What actually revived, and when I went to meet Jane in '78, I barely knew of her. I knew as a reporter for the New York Post, I sort of knew about this ruckus in the West Village, the urban renewal issue, not the park issue. And I had heard about the park issue. So she was not, she had her moment in the sun when the book was first published in '61, and then she faded from attention. In the late, I guess it was in the 90s, or maybe I can't quite remember, professor at NYU organized 3 exhibits around town about Moses in the Museum of the City of New York, and I can't remember the 3 sites. And of course, he included Jane in it. And suddenly, there was a spotlight on Jane again, and has remained so, and then even became greater after she died in '03. So my feeling was, if there were a chapter, an unpublished chapter, why wasn't it then published on its own about Jane after she died?
I think that it's so interesting that there are 3 mid-century women who are really Bessie Friedan, Rachel Carson with Silent Spring, and Jane Jacobs with Death and Life of American Cities. And these 3 women come at American society from completely unexpected directions. So you've got books which are resonating, whatever, you know, in the case of Rachel Carson, it's nearly 70 years. I mean, that much later. And these are really important books that don't necessarily immediately resonate, but are lying there underneath and become more and more important over the years. And it's extraordinary that these 3 women saw what was going on in some more profound way than, as you say, the official culture was telling them was going on at the time.
I want to take us to Caro again, and not the lost chapters, which I think are probably out there somewhere. Did he see your play? Have you talked to Caro about the play?
No.
No comments? No, nothing?
Nothing at all. He's absolutely uninterested.
Right.
Because he's got to finish Lyndon Johnson before he dies.
He can't take a night off and go to the theater?
That's really important to him.
He was asked something about the play. He says, I don't want to hear anything more about Robert Moses.
Exactly. That's his attitude. There's a rotten film, I think it's a rotten film, about him and Robert Gottlieb. I don't know if you've seen it.
Oh, I have.
And Robert Gottlieb was his editor. And because the film is made by Robert Gottlieb's daughter, it suggests that Robert Gottlieb is as great a figure as Robert Caro. It's about the crucial role of an editor in a writer's work. Now, the thing that distinguishes any well-known editor who has done really wonderful work, they will always give prime credit to the person who wrote the book, not to their work on the editing.
But their daughter will give them credit. Their daughter who made the film.
The daughter who made the film doesn't see things quite like that. She sees her dad as the hero of the Robert Moses and Lyndon Johnson volumes, which I don't think is quite right.
Yeah, and Caro's papers have now all gone to the New York
Historical Society, and there's
exhibit.
an exhibit. I don't know if it's still on, but it was a very interesting exhibit because Caro writes in longhand. So there were actually pages with things crossed off, remember, the way we used to do? So a writer friend of mine said years ago, something terrible is happening now that we're all writing on computers. You won't have the papers the way they had of writers of an earlier time. So to see the exhibit of Caro's papers are very interesting from that point of view. And I don't know, the mysterious chapter hasn't surfaced.
The most magnificent manuscript that is really worth looking at is The Importance of Being Earnest, which is in the British Museum. And if you look at that, some of the most famous lines in English literature are added afterwards.
Really?
He just puts a bubble on the page, and then there'll suddenly be a handbag or whatever. And they are the best lines. And so to a playwright, it is absolutely dazzling, the technique of a writer who can construct the play and then add the most famous lines you've ever heard. The witticisms are added later in bubbles. And that is one of the joys of manuscript, which, as you say, we're losing.
We're talking about source material and how writers work, et cetera. So to come up with your view of Moses, which is different than Caro's, did you look at other material, or
Oh,
was yeah? What help us? What helped you get that?
Well, as you know, like Roberta's book, there's a huge literature around this. There's a lot of film. Of course, because I was a friend of Joe Papp, you know, I think he has 3 big defeats, Moses, in the 1950s, doesn't he? His big defeats are Washington Square, the cross, you know, he was planning 3 crosstown expressways. That's the first defeat. The next is the children's playground, is that right? Which and one of the wonderful things about playing in New York was that I was corrected, because I said it was the ladies of the East Side who defeated him on that, but it's the ladies of the West Side.
Oh, yes.
Very important difference.
Very important.
This kind of crass error only an Englishman could make. And then the third defeat was the famous defeat by Joe Papp, who wanted to build the Delacorte Theatre in Central Park. And Moses, by then, just objected to anything that wasn't his idea. I mean, Joe was never able. And there are mysteries about, I'd like to move on to this, there are mysteries about Robert Moses. In other words, why did Moses fight so hard to prevent the building of the Delacorte Theatre, when it represented exactly the kind of demotic idealism that he had had as a young man? Joe always said that's why he tried to stop it, because he saw himself, his young self, in Joe's idealism about, let's create a theatre. It'll be in the middle of Central Park. It'll be free. It won't do rubbish. It'll do Shakespeare. And you kind of go, what possible objection could you have to that? It's such a brilliant idea. And Joe was the genius who saw it through. But Moses fought him all the way.
It wasn't his idea.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
It wasn't Moses. If Moses had thought about it, he would have loved it and made it happen.
Okay, so that might be the reason for that. Why does he go on believing in the motor car? It's I cannot ever get to the bottom of this. In other words, it is perfectly clear by the 1950s, surprisingly early, that the motor car is potentially an instrument of repression and oppression, not a simple liberator. It's complicated, and as you say, America is opened up. There is a theory I've heard many times that Eisenhower is the most influential American president of all time because he's the man who built the interstate highways. Yes, okay, you can see that, but these motor cars make urban living hell. They make it hell. And that is perfectly clear by the 1950s. Why does he go on believing in the motor car? And I'm not sure, do you know the answer to this?
I think so, because I studied this as well. He was not alone. The entire Madison Avenue, the entire corporate world, the entire governmental world was pushing the car. The car, Ford Motor Company, remember Ford became the head of Ford became defense secretary. The whole idea after World War II that to rebuild the country, you had to have a big idea. And the big ideas had won us the war in World War II. Why wouldn't the big idea work now? And the big idea was the car, and Eisenhower's vision was he had admired the Autobahn in Germany, and his vision was for defense purposes, we needed roads across the country for defense purposes. His vision was to go from city to city. What happened was that politically, when all this money became available for highways, the country was basically ruled by big city politicians, DeSapio in New York, Chicago, and all. And these guys looked at each other and they said, "Are you crazy? All that money's going to go to roads outside of our cities? We want that money for ourselves too." So the idea of the highway through the city as a vehicle to clean up the so-called slums, and the Bronx neighborhood, by the way, was not a slum, but to clean up all the slums, to bring the highway through the city. But this was the mindset of a nation. Moses was not alone, which is why he was so popular and believed in at the time. He wasn't creating a new idea. He was reflecting and feeding into the idea of this was the America, this was the vision. You look at the ads from the 1950s and the well-dressed ladies standing next to the Cadillac and the life of what was the American dream, was the automobile. And I
had to choose two, because I wanted to show the passage of time, and I wanted Moses to be one person in the first act and the second. I have a sort of counterplay, which I never wrote, which would be about the Cross-Bronx Expressway. In other words, the great crime, apart from his racism, and the unarguable crime, was the destruction of the Bronx. And there is absolutely no justification for what Moses did in the Bronx. He destroyed a living place by driving this huge, great road through it. And many times I have thought maybe my second act should have been about that, because that was the worst thing he ever did, without any question.
Well, but it feeds into what you did show, because when you show how within a few feet he could have gone around the orchard. Yeah. And what you don't show, but Caro writes about, he drove a highway right through a farmer's land, so the farmer couldn't drive the tractor from one side to the other side. But in the Cross Bronx, there was an alternative route,
certainly,
a minor change that would have, dislocated a handful of people and a handful of buildings.
But there almost always was an alternative.
There was always an alternative.
And I think you captured it so well when you basically says, once you show weakness, because it's the image of power.
He believed that if he climbed down on anything, he'd have to climb down on everything.
Yeah.
And that is classic. Sorry to say it again, but it is classic toxic white male behavior.
Well, you've given me a new term, David. I'm taking that home to New York.
At which we're at the time in the program where we're willing to entertain questions from toxic white men and other people who might be sitting in the audience that don't fit that description. So there are two people with mics who will be floating. I will try and identify you under the glaring lights. We would love that your comments are not comments, but are in the form of a question. So we're going to start with the mic is being passed to the lady in the second row, and let's tee up. There was a hand in back. If the mic could go to that gentleman for the next question, so we have this teed up. Please.
Okay. I'm going to start with a comment, because I can't resist. I am an urban planner by training. My specialty is transportation. And 15 of my 40 years were spent doing transportation planning in New York City in that area. And I just want to tell you, you captured the profession in what you did, that Robert Moses is the personification of what transportation has been and continues to be.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you for that, because it's an eye-opener for everyone who is...
It's a two-edged compliment.
Yeah. Well, there has been progress, too, and I won't get into that because that's beyond. But what do you see for the future in terms of how we can do things differently so that we don't end up in that, continue to be in that trap?
Yeah, but you see, I'm not an urban planner.
Well,
that's why your play's so good. Yeah. I'll answer that.
Yeah.
And I'm not an urban planner. I take pride in not being one. And by the way, Jane had an interesting view of transportation planners, because I used to say to her, Jane, how is this going to change? She said, well, this generation, we would have been talking in the 70s at the time, this generation has to die out. And the next generation will be more interested in light rail and rail. She was right up to a point, but not enough, because if you look at what's happening now across the country with the money provided under the Biden, infrastructure plan, there are still places adding a third lane to an already over-wide highway, as well as people going in transit. So I think it's really the future. I'll be the voice of Jane Jacobs. Listen to the people. I defy anyone. I have now written several books, and in each one of them, and even my last one, well, it wasn't the second to last one, I wrote a book about the recovery of New Orleans after Katrina. We're Still Here, You Bastards is the title. And that was a graffiti written on the side of a building by a young bike shop people who were tired of hearing all the experts saying, well, maybe we shouldn't rebuild the city. Maybe we should let it sink. And we're still here. Go listen. There are planners today who know how to listen. They're very rare, I have to say. It's something about the profession that is Moses-like. And so looking to the future, I can't say it enough, and get the power to listen to the people.
I guess it's good Diana didn't mention I have a master's in urban planning, so I just want to
Well, you obviously are enlightened.
Okay, question back there, and another hand, so we're lining up, maximizing. Okay, over there, great. So we've got next question, and then off to the other side.
So through your play, through your wonderful play, I was able to hear and learn about Robert Moses from him. And yet, he's not a likable guy. So how do you present a toxic white male, but still have audiences want to stay and not be overwhelmed by the toxicity?
Well, because that's what I do for a living. You know, I write all sorts of people. Well, you can see that I've written, you know, they used to say I was the women in my plays. And for years, I was the women in my plays. And then maybe now I'm the men in my plays. I don't know. But Ralph Fiennes loved Robert Moses. He loved playing him. He adores playing him. And you can see the relish in Ralph's performance. He adores him.
Yeah.
And he just thinks, and of course, it's what I think Philip Roth used to call releasing your demon. And that's something you do in art. It isn't necessarily something that's very advisable in life. But in art, that's one of the things we do. We write our worst selves. And we write the things that are dark and not very attractive, and maybe we wouldn't actually act out ourselves. And in doing so, I mean, much the greatest performance, if I can say this without hurting, oh God, there's a camera. One of the greatest performances in my work was Tony Hopkins, and Tony Hopkins playing a Rupert Murdoch figure in Pravda. You know, I've seen an awful lot of Rupert Murdochs since in fiction, and there isn't one who comes near Tony Hopkins. And yet everything Tony did was completely repellent. If you met that man in real life, you would just loathe him. He was, you know, pure destruction. But of course, in art, it's completely wonderful to be able to represent such people and have fun with them. And also, Ralph gives Moses maybe a soul and depth that maybe, I don't know, maybe he didn't possess in real life. I don't know.
He's fascinating. He's fascinating whether you like him or not. It's an extraordinary character, and he was real.
I mean, you know, Moses never answered Caro's book except in one statement. When an excerpt from the book appeared in the New Yorker, then Caro issued Moses issued in response such a highfalutin reply to it, and it's full of classical references and Herodotus and Aeschylus, and it sort of names all these, you know, insanely highbrow authors and stuff. And he never actually responded to the book itself, and that in itself is rather sort of.
I have to tell you how Moses reacted to Jane's book.
Yeah.
He sent it back to the executive editor, Bennett Cerf, and with some kind of comment about essentially this is trash. But I also think it's important to note that when Jane's first book came out, She was the housewife. Nobody gave her credit for being a journalist.
She was a journalist.
She was a journalist. She was writing for an architectural magazine, but she was referred to as the housewife that wrote a book. Lewis Mumford, who was kind of insulted because he thought Jane was going to be his acolyte. He wrote a review in the New Yorker magazine. Mother Jacob's Home Remedies was the title. So you have to understand that when Jane wrote her book, women, as you said, Betty Friedan.
But that's why it relates to those 3 mid-century women who are all crucial in American intellectual history.
And it's very important when you talk about any of these people and any of these issues is to keep them in their time period.
Exactly.
Yeah. Other questions out there? I think we have one on the right, and if there's some, yes, and another one teed up there, so let's start. Thank you.
Yes, I wonder, David, if you could talk a little bit more about Robert Moses as a tragic figure. And also, as you do that, can you tie in a little more about him as a man and about the way you talk about, in a way, masculinity itself within the play?
Well, I think that we all have a great deal of difficulty adapting to the way the world is changing around us. As somebody put it to me the other day, there is nothing more difficult in the world than knowing that your moment is over. And I think that what Moses is doing in the second half of his life is clinging on to a landscape which has changed out of all recognition. And he believes, I think he still believes he's doing good, which is where I disagree with Caro. But I don't think that he is doing good. He's doing terrible, terrible harm. And so to me, this is tragic because he's trapped. There was a line, and often you build a play around a line that's in your head. And I had a line in the play where Fionnuala said, "Is there anything more tragic than being trapped in an idea?" And Nick Heitner, who is a very clever man, said to me at a certain point, "Could we take that line out, do you think?" And you build a play on scaffolding, and that idea is the scaffolding of the play, and there's a point at which the play ceases to need that scaffolding because the play is there and it stands without it being drawn attention to. And once I took that line out, the scene was much better. And yet that's the underlying idea of the whole play, and that's what I relate to when I talk about toxicity. That's what I relate. It's very, very hard if you have a very strong vision of what you would like your life to be, to adapt to the circumstances in which your vision no longer applies and is no longer good. And that, to me, is tragic. That's what I mean by tragedy, that you can't move on and you can't move your ideas on. And that's the dimension of him, I think, that most attracted me.
Off in the back, I think.
So you said you invented Fionnuala. Did you also invent Porter, or was Porter there and getting...
Fionnuala and Porter, and these are all invented characters around him. Yeah, they're just the people who worked for him were in the way of people who work for very strong characters. Joe Papp, obviously, I worked for Joe Papp. Joe was Moses writ. There were elements of Joe that weren't so dissimilar to Moses, including a friend of mine. I don't know if anybody's ever read that book, Hitler's Table Talk, which is Hugh Trevor Roper's account of what it was like to have dinner with Hitler, and meaning that Hitler dominated the conversation so completely and nobody else was allowed to speak. Hello, Joe Papp. And dinner with Joe was Joe talking.
Yeah.
That's what it was. But like Moses, and Joe was a genius, and I don't get me wrong, he achieved more in the American theater than anyone in the 20th century. But having said that, he was surrounded by loyal people whose loyalty was constantly tested. At what point are you going to break with the so-called great man? And that's always the problem for the people who surround the great man. At what point do you go, I can't put up with this any longer? And the two of them sit in a room with him, watching him do these terrible, terrible things, and ignore, not listen. And at a certain point, they go, I can't sit there any longer. And I've watched that happen with so-called, in quotes, great men. And it happens with great men. How much longer do we put up with this?
Did Moses, Moses is so seen as being surrounded by men.
Yeah.
The testosterone level in that office,
yeah.
It was all male.
Yeah.
And the Moses men, this is back to the reference to the mafia, which he wasn't, but he did have this network of people who were his disciples,
yeah.
which then continued his mindset
Loyalists.
well after he left those positions.
Yeah.
And so
but that's why
women,
I wanted to put a woman right beside him, and a woman of conscience, and a woman who came out of the tenements, and a woman, I was very, very pleased with somebody who said that Fionnuala is the central character in the drama, and I don't know who said that to me, but when they said it, I went, somebody understands me. And of course today we're here to talk about Moses, but dramatically for me as an architect of plays, it's what Fionnuala says and does that to me is also, I hope it's moving, because it's about the plight of when do you interrupt and say no.
And when do we interrupt and say no? We can say yes to one more question, and then we must cease. There's a hand here. If you can get a mic there quickly, that would be terrific.
And while we're waiting, I just want to recommend to all of you who have not read the Caro book, don't be over-intimidated. There are 2 chapters you need to read, and it's about the Cross Bronx Expressway. They are the only 2 chapters you need to read, and it will tell you everything.
But one thing, when you said that Jane Jacobs and her husband read that in bed, were they in bed for a month?
I guess they were.
It's a final question.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you guys for being here. In the play, there was a great line where Robert Moses says something about, no one cares about a shed, give me a bridge and I can get all the money you want. I think that's such a quintessentially American idea, but also we still struggle with that. Big ideas are so compelling and probably to the detriment of a more incremental urbanism that Jane Jacobs really represents. So I wonder if you two can kind of discuss that a little bit.
Well, that's what Jane Jacobs was objecting to, wasn't it? She was objecting to exactly that idea that people get turned on by size, and they get turned on by, undoubtedly what she most attacked. And there are all sorts of her ideas with which I fundamentally agree. But these building huge, great slabs where people live and there is absolutely no street life below, and nothing is happening on the ground, is obviously catastrophic. But that was, the kind of project that was popular after the war.
And I think there's a sad truth today. I don't think it's just in New York. I think New York is an exaggeration of what's everywhere else in the country. There are elected officials who understand, but they are prisoners of their contributors. And in New York and in so many other places, the largest contributors are the developers who are doing the things that many of us hate. So I believe this firmly, but I will sound like Jane. It's left up to the people to resist as well as they can, and they will get as far or farther in some places than others. You cannot expect it from the people at the top. The power is not is such that it does not allow for these kind of things. They sometimes articulate the ideas, they claim to believe in them, and then when push comes to shove, they're not there, unless they are pushed into it by the local people.
And I think here's to the local people, and we are almost at the end. Thank you, David. Thank you, Roberta.
You've all expressed your thanks to David, to Roberta, and to Tony. May I add mine? Roberta, David, Tony, thank you so much for such a stimulating and invigorating and thought-provoking session. As some of you will have recognized by looking at the program, town planning is deliberately one of the issues which is also relevant to Charleston, as it is to Great Britain, as it is to America in New York, which will be threading its way through the program today. As you are leaving, remember that we have some interesting merchandise in the foyer, and David has already signed some books which he will personalize. Roberta will sign some books, and we look forward to seeing you at future sessions. Thank you, all of you.